Hey, welcome everybody to another edition of the ME Trainer Academy. This edition of the Trainer Academy is a really special edition, and one of the things that's really going to help trainers get a handle on female fat loss. I really call this whole idea the female fat loss formula because there's some very specific ideas that are unique to women, especially women who reach the menopause, perimenopausal, and postmenopausal women. They have specific concerns to address. And as trainers, really most of the people we work with fall in this age bracket. And so we really need to kind of understand how to deal with them. One of the things that I will say is there is a ton of information on this topic. And so I won't be able to cover everything, and it may seem like at times I'm jumping around a little bit. I'll try to keep it as linear as possible for you. But I also want to say that the information in this area is based on research, but also on clinical experience, because there's not a ton of research on this, on the effects of estrogens and progesterones and what these things do, although almost everything I talk about will have a basis of research to it. And as always, in your resource section to download, you can download some of the articles and things like that I use and we use here at Metabolic Effect as our reference points. So let's go ahead and get started. The first thing that we want to cover is really the, to get us really set so everyone kind of understands, is the female reproductive cycle. So let's just look at, in a normal female, what happens throughout menses and through the menstrual cycle. So if we start down here on the left, on my left, all the way over here, we can see this is, let's say this is day 1, the first day of menses. Day 14 in most women is where ovulation occurs, where the egg is released from the ovaries. And then over here, let's say this is day 28, the end of the cycle. So first what I'm going to do is give you an idea of what happens with estrogen. So here's what begins to happen with estrogen. So estrogen kind of comes up like this, comes down a little bit, and then has another little up peak and then drops like that, okay? So it's kind of this distribution with estrogen. Now I'll do progesterone in a dotted line so you can see what happens with progesterone. Progesterone more looks like this. Just like that. So what you can begin to see here very clearly is in the female reproductive cycle, first you will see estrogen levels, estrogen dominance really occurring the first 2 weeks up to ovulation, where then you see both estrogen and progesterone up, but you see a progesterone type dominance. So this is the progesterone time. And so if we look at this, you'll see that estrogen really is this phase, the first phase of the female menstrual cycle is called the follicular phase. And then this second phase here where progesterone is dominant is called the luteal phase. And so I want you to kind of keep in mind that what happens in the normal female cycle, and what should happen, is that there's an estrogen dominant time and a progesterone dominant time. The first 2 weeks estrogen, the next 2 weeks progesterone. And what you'll find is one of the first things you want to think about is women who are having menstrual disorders. And this is hard to pin down because a lot of women are on oral contraceptives or HRT. And what happens is this distribution goes away. So if you have someone who's on hormone replacement therapy, whether it's hormone replacement therapy through menopause or oral contraceptives, you want to ask them how their menses was before going on the pill so you can kind of get a good idea of what problems they were dealing with. Oftentimes the biggest issue will be, and I'm going to repeat this over and over again, but the biggest issue will be an estrogen dominance with progesterone being low throughout the cycle in a distribution that looks more like this. And that can create all kinds of problems that we'll get to in a minute, but I kind of wanted to give you that as a precursor of where we start here. Now, one of the things that I want to do right off the bat as well is I want to talk to you a little bit about what estrogen and progesterone do related to fat loss. And this is a very hard concept to get to because really hormones have direct effects, then they kind of have secondary effects, and then those effects need to be looked at in the context of other hormones. And so let's look at it that way, because really both estrogen and progesterone can be both fat burning and fat storing depending on their primary effects, secondary effects, and then what other hormones they're around. So I want to take them one by one just to kind of get us squared away here. Estrogen is primarily, when you look at estrogen, a lot of people think estrogen is actually a fat storing hormone, but it's actually primary effects all by itself is a fat burning hormone. And that's because what it does is it decreases lipoprotein lipase, which you may remember from past ME trainer academies is the key enzyme that stores fat in the fat cell. This is the enzyme that insulin promotes greatly. So estrogen really blocks the action of insulin. So when you think estrogen, think insulin opposition. This is why this becomes an issue for women as they hit menopause, because estrogen levels will drop and women will become automatically at menopause far more insulin resistant or carbohydrate sensitive. So they can't eat the same amount of carbs that they once did because of this effect. Now you might say, well, what about the fact that I've heard estrogen causes fat storage? Well, one of the things that happens is estrogen can increase the alpha adrenergic receptors in the butts, hip, and thighs of women. So you might say, all right, well, what's an alpha adrenergic receptor? On the hips, butt, and thighs, you have alpha adrenergic receptors and beta adrenergic receptors. And these aren't just in the butt, hips, and thighs, but in women, the distribution of these two things is important. Alpha adrenergic receptors and beta adrenergic receptors are bound by the catecholamines, adrenaline and noradrenaline. As you know, or if you don't know, adrenaline and noradrenaline are your key fat-burning gas pedals. So they are directly fat-burning. When they bind on a cell, so if we look at a fat cell, and we'll say we have a receptor on this cell that looks like this, and then we have another receptor on a cell that looks like that. And let's say this is the beta adrenergic receptor, and this is the alpha adrenergic receptor. What happens is when the beta receptor is stimulated by the catecholamines, fat burning is increased. When the alpha adrenergic receptors are stimulated by the catecholamines, fat burning is decreased. What happens with estrogen is estrogen puts a large amount of alpha adrenergic receptors in the hips, butt, and thighs of women, so that you have a lot of alphas relative to betas in the lower body of women, and estrogen is responsible for that. So estrogen indirectly can cause the female fat distribution, what is known as the gynoid distribution or lower body fat storage, simply because it results in greater amounts of these alpha adrenergic receptors. This is important for you to understand, because when you're working with clients as a trainer or as a fat loss coach, you want to understand that is why if you just increase intensity of exercise, you just keep burning calories off of them, and you don't change the hormonal situation, what you may find is they lose fat everywhere but in the lower body. It's a common complaint, and you want to know how to deal with that. Okay, so that's one way that estrogen can store fat. Another way estrogen can store fat when estrogen gets too high is that estrogen can interrupt thyroid hormone. So it can block the action of thyroid hormone at high levels. And thyroid is very much like the catecholamines in that it stimulates and causes adipose tissue to release its fat stores or cause cells to burn fat. So in that respect, we can see that estrogen can be globally fat burning because of its opposition to insulin. But then it has these secondary effects if it's too high that make it store fat down near the bottom. And also if estrogen gets too out of balance with progesterone, for instance, it can have anti-thyroid effects. So estrogen is fat burning when it's balanced, but can be fat storing in certain areas, and also fat storing related to its effects on thyroid. So fat burning and fat storing. That's important for people to know. It's both. Then what about progesterone? Well, progesterone, when you think about progesterone, you want to think about anti-estrogen effects. So progesterone kind of opposes the action of estrogen in what it does. It has been shown to increase lipoprotein lipase, very much like insulin does. So in that sense, progesterone is fat storing. Again, people tend to misinterpret these two, but this is what the research actually shows us. And there's another hormone called APC, or I'm sorry, ASP, and this is very much like insulin. Both insulin and ASP are the two primary promoters of fat gain in individuals. And this ASP is important in women, and it is also stimulated by progesterone. So progesterone has two effects. One, it stimulates lipoprotein lipase like insulin does. Two, it stimulates ASP. Both of these lead to fat storage. However, just like with estrogen, that's not the whole story with progesterone. Progesterone is also anti-cortisol. So progesterone blocks the action of cortisol, meaning that it creates decreased fat gain in the abdomen. Okay? So progesterone is, again, just like estrogen, it's fat storing because of its effects on lipoprotein lipase and ASP, but it's fat burning because it's anti-cortisol around the middle. Cortisol and insulin together lead to fat storage around the middle. So the interesting thing about these particular hormones is you really want an optimal estrogen-progesterone ratio. You want the estrogen to progesterone ratio to be in balance so that you can get some of the fat burning responses of both these hormones. So when you think of estrogen, think of anti-insulin when it's in balance. It opposes the fat storing of insulin. And when you think of progesterone, think of anti-cortisol. It opposes the action of cortisol. So having these both in balance is really nice to have. And now I'm going to show you a little bit about what happens with this. So this is global fat storage in terms of insulin. So this estrogen will reduce and get women lean all over their body, where progesterone will cause leanness just in the middle. So you can see these two hormones together lead to the typical young female fat distribution, the hourglass shape. A little bit of holding of fat in the lower body, thin waist, the hourglass gynoid shape when these are in balance, when estrogen and progesterone are in balance. Now, what ends up happening with estrogen and progesterone is they can get out of balance. You might say, why can they get out of balance? Well, one of the things that can happen with estrogen and progesterone is that there are a lot of estrogen compounds in our environment. Young women make estrogen in their ovaries. Young women and older women will make estrogen in their fat cells through the enzyme aromatase. Pesticides, cosmetics, plastics, styrofoam, phytoestrogen plants like soy, etc., give us a lot of estrogen exposures. Eating hormones in meat, pesticides on fruits and vegetables lead to a ton of estrogen exposure. Both men and women are exposed to this estrogen a lot in our society. However, there are no progesterone effects. In other words, there are really no progesterone mimickers in the environment. And so what can happen is the ratio of estrogen to progesterone can get out of whack. And when that begins to happen, as with all hormones, what you can begin to have happen is when estrogen is in balance, it's benefiting you. But when it gets very, very high, a lot of people understand that you can develop hormone resistance. And you can do and develop hormone resistance with all your hormones. The other key point to understand about this, and I'm going slow because this gets complicated, is that progesterone optimizes estrogen receptors, and estrogen receptors optimize progesterone receptors. In other words, during the luteal phase, the last 2 weeks of the menstrual cycle, when progesterone is dominant, it is sort of priming the estrogen receptors for the first 2 weeks of the cycle. And vice versa. Estrogen tends to prime progesterone. So these two are reliant on each other. What begins to happen, though, as estrogen levels go up and up and up, is you begin to get resistance in both the estrogen receptors and the progesterone receptors. So now you have higher estrogen, lower progesterone, and resistance in both, leading to fat gain globally, but especially around the middle. And so these women start to look a lot like the male distribution. And you see this a lot now in younger women, but especially in menopause, this kind of stuff is beginning to happen. And this is a key issue you have to deal with when you're dealing with hormone-specific female fat loss. You can't think of this just in calories, and you also cannot think of it just in terms of insulin and cortisol, because the way estrogen and progesterone are being impacted here. So that is a really important concept to understand. So now we're in a situation where when this is going on, you have several things that begin to happen in this female-specific issue. You have very high estrogen. You have lower progesterone from the relative perspective. And then one of the things that can begin to happen here is because of the effects of luteinizing hormone, which is another hormone we really won't get into, it will sense this issue, this estrogen resistance. So even though it's high, the brain isn't sensing it as enough, and what you'll end up getting is high testosterone levels as well. So you might think, well, isn't that a good thing, Jade? Well, you also do not want very, very high testosterone in women who have this estrogen and progesterone issue going on, because it's not going to make them thin when they have insulin resistance, estrogen resistance, a estrogen to progesterone imbalance, and very high testosterone. What it's going to do is it's going to cause increased muscle gain. Yes, these women will not necessarily not have muscle. They will, but they also will be fat. So you kind of get this heavy, muscly, muscle fat look, so to speak. And this is a common issue in what we call PCOS. Thin women can also have PCOS, but it's more common for women to be obese. And one of the things that's happening here is insulin resistance comes right along with this. So the idea behind this is we need to correct this excess estrogen. We need to raise this progesterone. And usually we want to divert this testosterone to be used to burn fat. And usually when these two correct, the testosterone will figure itself out automatically. But we're going to kind of go through how to begin to adjust this. One thing I want to cover real quick before we go on is to come back to this cycle. Here's ovulation. Here's day 28. Here is estrogen, and here is progesterone. And I want to cover just a little bit here about what's happening in a normal woman. So let's say this woman is not someone who's dealing with this PCOS or excess estrogen progesterone issue. They're just a normal woman. They have normal function. How might you address their diet and exercise program? Well, here they are mostly estrogen dominant. So here they can get away with a little bit higher carbohydrate intake, right? Because estrogen impacts them in a way that makes them more insulin sensitive in a way, because it blocks the action of lipoprotein lipase. Whereas here, they're more progesterone dominant. They're going to want to watch their carb intake. So you might say, where am I getting that from? It's really because of the effect that progesterone has on lipoprotein lipase and estrogen has on lipoprotein lipase. Remember, lipoprotein lipase is the primary fat-storing enzyme that is elicited by insulin. Carbs raise insulin, which stimulate lipoprotein lipase. Estrogen blocks that, so that people are going to be a little bit more carb sensitive in the first, carbohydrate or insulin resistant, or insulin sensitive rather. People are going to be more insulin sensitive during this first part of the menstrual cycle and more insulin resistant here. So lipoprotein lipase activity is going to be downregulated here, allowing more carbohydrate intake, versus here will be upregulated, meaning that they're going to want to watch their carbohydrate intake. That's the first piece of this. The second piece of this is because estrogen makes you burn more fat at all exercise intensities, lower intensity exercise will be more beneficial here, and because progesterone blocks the action of cortisol, you can use that for more high intensity exercise here. So this is just a really interesting way to begin to tailor the diet and exercise programs to maximize benefit. So if you have a woman who has a normal cycle like this and hasn't trained this way, you can actually cater the training to this cycle. So here would be, maybe 3 days per week of moderate intensity jogging, biking, that kind of stuff, and maybe 2 days per week weight training, and a little bit higher carb diet. Now, by higher carb, we mean, relatively speaking, any very high carb diet is going to cause fat gain, but you can get away with a little bit more here. One of the things I like to do then is come over here and say, all right, well, here we can do, let's say 2 days a week of high intensity interval training, 3 days per week of weight training, and lower carb intake. And this allows us to potentially adjust this. And if you understand kind of what I'm saying here, you can begin to manipulate this in a lot of different ways. The essential point is here, during this point in time, you will burn more fat at all exercise intensities, high or low. So you might just say, well, Jade, I don't like doing any long duration cardio. I want to do high intensity stuff. That's fine. But just understand that you can adjust this, because as we all know, there's some people who love to run. They love their long distance cardio. That's going to be more beneficial here the first 2 weeks versus the last 2 weeks. So that's a pretty good tool to understand. One of the other things we need to cover here is the idea of estrogen detox. And so a lot of people don't realize that there's different estrogens in the body. And there's also different estrogens in hormone replacement therapy and oral contraceptive pills. So let me cover that real quick. HRT and OCP. So this is hormone replacement therapy and oral contraceptive pills. These are higher estrogens. What do I mean by that? They're more powerful estrogens. In other words, the estrogens that are in HRT and OCPs are estrogens that come from horses. They're not like human estrogen, okay? What that does is create much, much stronger effects And as we talked about before, if these are in high doses, this can exacerbate this estrogen-progesterone ratio issue that we've talked about. And so what you want to look at is, you might say, well, Jade, why then when I go on HRT or OCP, how come some people will lose fat on those and how come some people will gain fat on those? One of the things that happens is it all depends, because as we know, estrogens can be fat burning. That's their primary action. However, if they get out of balance with progesterone and they have stronger effects, you can get that resistance issue we talked about and the anti-thyroid effects we talked about. So what happens with most medical doctors who are prescribing these is they prescribe across the board. They don't have adjustable and cyclical ways that they do this. They give one dose usually across the board. And for some women, that dose will be appropriate and maybe help them lose fat. And for some, and a lot more than we think, it will create an issue. And of course, the doctors aren't talking to them about carbohydrate intake either when they go on this stuff. So that's why you can get varying effects. You might say, well, does HRT and oral contraceptive pills help my clients gain weight or lose weight? It could be either. And sometimes you'll see the effects when they go off or on. You can see them gain weight or lose weight. So here is the message in this. If someone is put on hormone replacement therapy and actually begins to gain fat, then you as a trainer know right away that there is an estrogen dominance issue that has been made worse and that you need to work on detoxing estrogens, raising progesterones, and dealing with that, which we're going to get to in a minute. However, if they go on HRT and they begin to burn fat, you can then assume that they had a proper estrogen progesterone ratio, or I should say more proper, and that you're getting some of the effects they want. I would argue that you still want to work on making sure you balance the estrogen progesterone ratio, because there's other hormonal effects here. We really can't look at these hormones in complete isolation. So that's one thing that we want to look at. The other thing that we want to look at here as well is that these things, HRT and OCPs, also have stronger progesterones in there. So they use progestins. And these progestins in here can have stronger progesterone effects, but also end up lowering our body's own progesterone. So you can imagine, because this is foreign to our body, it's not what our body makes, it will interact strongly with certain aspects of our physiology and block other aspects of our physiology. So that's why these things are really not the way to go. Anytime you have a client that's asking your advice for education, it's probably best to let them and advise them, if they're going to go on these things, to do natural, bioidentical hormone replacement therapy so that you can kind of understand this. But at least you understand that there's stronger estrogens and weaker estrogens, and the estrogens and progesterones that are present in hormone replacement therapy and oral contraceptive pills are stronger than the ones that we naturally make, and that can create issues, cluing you in on where to go next. In our own body, though, there's different types of estrogens. In your body, there's different estrogen metabolites. 2-hydroxyestrogen is one. And then you have a few others here that we know of. And there's actually more than this, but these are the most important ones that we have the most research on now. So in the liver, your body will metabolize, female bodies will metabolize estrogen. And what ends up happening is you can have stronger or weaker estrogens made in this detoxification situation. The 4-hydroxy and 16-hydroxy estrogens are much stronger than the 2-hydroxys. And they are the ones that are associated with increased risk of some of the estrogen-related cancers and things like that. And this is more weaker. So the 2-hydroxy estrogen are the ones you want. They're more normal. These two can get you in trouble. So there's also an issue here when you're working with your clients about detoxing the estrogens appropriately. Detoxing the 2-hydroxy estrogens so they do not turn into the 4 and 16-hydroxy estrogens. And in our clinic, we actually use a test to look at this in women. And there's a lot of things that you can do to balance that I'm going to cover in just a minute. But hopefully you sort of understand how this works. You can also understand that a lot of the compounds that come in through our environment, like bisphenol A and pesticides and all that kind of stuff, they may have weaker and or stronger effects than our own estrogen. And sometimes it's a stronger effect just simply because there's so many there. So this is another concept to understand. If you're getting more of these 4-hydroxy and 16-hydroxy estrogen effects, then that estrogen-progesterone ratio issue becomes a significant factor. So one of the other very important concepts I want to cover with you is the idea of, when we talked before, we talked about estrogen being more related to insulin, and we talked a little bit about progesterone being more related to cortisol. So I want to tell you a little bit more about that progesterone-cortisol relationship, just a little bit more. In your adrenal glands, you have a hormone called pregnenolone, and pregnenolone is the mother hormone. That's what they call it because it derives other hormones. Well, pregnenolone can be made into progesterone. Pregnenolone can also be made into estrogen via a pathway that involves a hormone called DHEA that many may have heard of. And then DHEA can be made into testosterone and estrogen. And then interestingly enough here, testosterone can actually be made into estrogen via a hormone called, or an enzyme called aromatase. And actually, women who go through menopause continue to make estrogen in their fat cells via the aromatase enzyme. So they can make estrogen via aromatase. And this testosterone to estrogen thing that can occur in men, making men have feminization, or what is known as man boobs, and fat gain around the nipples as well. So aromatase becomes a situation that can increase some of that estrogen issue as well. But here's what I really wanted to talk about here. You can get cortisol from progesterone. So here's the concept here. There's something in alternative medicine that we call pregnenolone or progesterone steal. In the conventional world, they argue whether this happens or not, but we work with this all the time in the alternative medicine field. What happens is, under periods of high stress, these pathways here will begin to speed up because the body under stress needs more cortisol. What that does is deplete the adrenal reserves of pregnenolone or progesterone, essentially stealing pregnenolone and progesterone away to make cortisol. And this can greatly exacerbate the estrogen-progesterone ratio imbalance. And this becomes far, far more important when you have women going through menopause. Because what happens is they continue to make estrogen in their fat cells. They're getting all this environmental estrogen exposure we've talked about. And they're having lower progesterone because they don't get a lot of progesterone exposure in the environment. And they have now in the adrenal glands this situation where pregnenolone is being pulled and progesterone is being pulled to make more cortisol. So this is one of the things, one of the reasons why we think that women begin to store so much fat around the middle. Not only because their global fat burning potential goes down because estrogen's gone, but also because progesterone levels go away. This estrogen-progesterone ratio is created. This ratio issue is created, and you get less progesterone through this progesterone steal. So that's a really important concept that we have to understand. Now what I want to do is cover briefly, before we get into what the female fat loss formula is, I want to cover testosterone in women and human growth hormone in women. Now you may have been confused because earlier we were talking about how there's this negative response of very high estrogen, lower progesterone, and then testosterone being created because of the very high estrogen and potential estrogen resistance, and the body then releasing things like luteinizing hormone and things like that to try to bolster estrogen and progesterone production, and then creating extra testosterone because of that. But in a normal woman, testosterone is still a fat burning and muscle building hormone. And here's how we know that it has these same effects. It's because if we take transsexuals who are going from female to male, and we give them steroid-based hormones of testosterone, they will lose fat around their lower body because it blocks the action of estrogen. They will get very lean in their triceps, and they also will have some reduction of fat around the middle. Also, human growth hormone is hugely important here because it, just like testosterone, will burn fat and build muscle. This is important to remember because women who go through menopause, who now have lower estrogen overall, their own production, and are having lower progesterone, and so they have this issue where they start to store fat around the middle because of that, these two hormones end up becoming fairly important for them because these two hormones will block some of the action of fat gain around the middle. So women, especially women who are menopausal, postmenopausal women, need to understand the importance of testosterone. And the interesting thing is, in our field, a lot of people are afraid, a lot of women are afraid of testosterone. How do you know if a woman is having potential low testosterone effects? Low libido is one important thing there. So I wanted to point this out, that we need to do what we can to maximize testosterone and human growth hormone in women in general. Of course, they're going to be less than they would be in men, at least testosterone would be. Actually, women have more human growth hormone from a relative perspective than men do. But we want to maximize these, especially in postmenopausal women who are having this fat gain around the middle. So that's an important concept before we get into the female fat loss formula. Okay, so let's get into this issue with the female fat loss formula. So what do you do with this information then? So I have really 4 steps I went ahead and put up here on the board to help you kind of understand where to start. The first issue is that we have to deal with insulin. So it really does come back to being that simple, but here's why it becomes so important for women, especially women who are going through menopause. The first thing you want to do is drastically lower insulin and realize that estrogen is an opposition to insulin. So younger women, they are not as insulin resistant or as carbohydrate sensitive because they have estrogen working to their advantage. They have estrogen opposing the fat storing of insulin to a large degree. Younger women do, especially when estrogen is in balance with progesterone. So as soon as you get into this estrogen-progesterone imbalance, and that can happen due to use of oral contraceptive pills or HRT or environmental exposures of estrogen. For any number of reasons, this can happen in younger women. This estrogen-progesterone ratio can become an issue. And then it always tends to happen in older women who go through menopause. But as soon as that happens, you have to begin to coach these women is that they are far more carbohydrate sensitive. So they will need to drastically reduce carbohydrates and all their insulin exposures. So the first thing to do is to reduce carbohydrates, reduce the starches to very low levels. The other thing to begin to do is to realize there are other foods that can cause insulin production that may have been very healthy foods and helpful foods previously that are not now. Namely, dairy is one, not eggs necessarily, but dairy-related proteins, milk proteins, because they are low glycemic index but high insulin producing. So you may be wanting to cut out dairy at this point as well. And then the other piece here is that they may even be so sensitive at this point that they need to begin to cut out fruits as well. And that is a shocking thing for a lot of these women because they begin to see, at least when you think about milk and fruits, they see these as very, very healthy, especially with the whole calcium issue that will do. But that is what is needed in these women who are fat loss resistant due to this estrogen progesterone effect. This is one of the first things that needs to happen, is to drastically reduce the carbohydrates. If you want an off-the-shelf diet here, the one that we would use or recommend here is the paleo diet with sparse fruits or with the fruits removed. So primarily things that are, vegetable-based, lean animal protein-based, and then a few of the starches, but very low glycemic index starches like brown rice or quinoa or a little bit of beans, but those should be very limited. So in other words, they should be doing very small amounts of carbohydrate, 3 to 5 bites at a meal. And if that's too much, move all their carbohydrates to nighttime is a good thing, because a lot of these women, especially in menopause, are having difficulty sleeping. So a little bit of carbohydrate dose at night without having carbs all day long can help them sleep. And if they can go without carbohydrates, that's fine as well. Another way to lower insulin is to have a long fasting period. So sometimes we will have these women do from 12 to 14-hour fasts at night. So having their last meal at 8 p.m. maybe, and going all the way to 10 a.m. before they have their next meal. Then they eat every 2 to 4 hours at that point in time to balance themselves out, keeping carbohydrates to a minimum. This is key. The next key is to really look at the cortisol effect. So this really is because estrogen is gone and you have this estrogen ratio issue. And I want to just take a second to explain that again, because it's going to be one of these things that is really confusing for you guys when you begin to think about this, because here is what happens. I've told you estrogen burns fat. So it can get confusing, because if you become estrogen dominant, you would think, well, that means I have more fat burning potential. But that estrogen dominance, remember, relies on progesterone to keep the estrogen receptor sensitive. And even when the estrogen gets too high relative to progesterone, then you can have thyroid effects as well. So it really is the balance here. And here's what happens at menopause. Let's say estrogen levels here and progesterone levels here. What happens at menopause is they both drop like this, okay? But the spread gets bigger. So now what happens is you have more estrogen dominance. And so that's why it's so important to take care of the insulin, because of the drop in estrogen. But then you got to take care of the cortisol issue, because your progesterone effects are gone as well. So how do you do that? This is when you have women who you got to really look and pay attention to their stress effects. Are they sleeping appropriately? And then what do they do with exercise? Because one of the best things to handle the cortisol ratio is to adjust exercise. All exercise except very low intensity exercise will raise cortisol. So the first thing you want them to do is go to very low exercise. Leisure walking all the time. Nice, slow leisure walks. Restorative yoga, not the high intensity types. Tai Chi, those kinds of things. Spa treatments, anything that is stressful or not stressful and relaxing. So they can do as much of that activity as they like. Low, very low intensity exercise. But then we still want to get some of the human growth hormone and testosterone effects to counteract the missing progesterone that they might have. That involves high intensity, shorter duration exercise, high intensity interval training, and resistance-based training. And these workouts should be relatively short, 30 to 40 minutes max, and they should be intense. That will raise cortisol, yes, but it raises human growth hormone and testosterone to balance it out, versus moderate intensity, long duration exercise, which will raise cortisol without the human growth hormone testosterone advantage, exacerbating things. And this is why some women will be runners their whole life and be able to eat high carb diets their whole life and not have an issue, then go through menopause and realize that the running and all of that kind of stuff is just not doing it anymore. This is when you move them to high intensity interval training, high intensity weight training, and then if they want to do more than 40 minutes, which a lot of people will, then you have them do leisure walking as much as possible. So that's the other piece here. Now we get into this idea of balancing and detoxing estrogen. And this is tricky. So how do you balance this estrogen-progesterone ratio? One of the things that we like to use in our clinic is a mix of black cohosh and chaste tree or vitex, those herbs. Black cohosh is an interesting herb to use, and you're going to see that in your downloadable forms you can have the doses that we use. But black cohosh, a lot of people get confused by that because they say, well, look, you're talking about all this estrogen exposure, but black cohosh is a phytoestrogen. And that research is sort of old. It is a kind of a phytoestrogen in its activity, but it has estrogen mimicking effects that aren't really stimulating the body in the same way that estrogens would from pesticides and things of that nature. So black cohosh can have some gentle estrogen stimulating effects to give you maybe some of this fat burning potential, but not necessarily exacerbate the estrogen dominance that you have. And this is really just from clinical experience. There is some research that suggests this, but what we used to do is we used to maybe give Vitex, just Vitex, or just progesterone cream with no black cohosh, but it seems adding black cohosh, which is estrogenic herb, and adding Vitex with it tends to do really nice things related to the estrogen-progesterone balance and the function that women have, both younger women who are dealing with this and older women who are dealing with this past menopause. So those two herbs you want to think about immediately when you think about this potential estrogen-progesterone balance. Then you also can begin to think about the hormone that we covered, pregnenolone, we tend to use, and it works very well because it can derive both progesterone, DHEA, testosterone, and estrogen, and that falls with age. So we oftentimes like to use pregnenolone. Of course, other alternative practitioners will get into using bioidentical hormone replacement therapy. That's something you're going to be referring out to, and that can be very useful when done under the guidance of a natural health prescriber. I'm not going to go into the formulas we use on that because it's sort of beyond the scope of what you would be able to do anyway. If you want some good references on that, there's books out there that you can get and look at. The detox effect is really trying to detox from all these extra xenoestrogens that are coming in through bisphenol A and canned foods and plastics and pesticides and hormone-laden meats. And really what those involve is a very high concentration or intake of the brassica family. It tends to do a great job at helping detoxify and make more of the 2-hydroxyestrogens versus the 4 and 16, and also help to negate some of the effects of these xenoestrogens that we're having. Diindolylmethane, or DIM, is a great product, and that is really the concentrated form of what you're getting in these brassica families. Also resveratrol, and also another great one is green tea extracts. These things all will help detox, as well as giving these women plenty of good fiber to keep the bowels going so they can remove some of these excess estrogens when they come in. So that is a very important concept to begin using. We use a product from a company called Designs for Health called FemGuard that has a lot of these detox nutrients in there, as well as the estrogen, progesterone balancing Chase Tree and Vitex that we like to use. And then the final piece here is to raise human growth hormone and testosterone. And I kind of covered that up here when we're dealing with cortisol. Fat loss and muscle building really has a lot to do between the cortisol, human growth hormone, and testosterone ratio. There are really only a few ways to raise human growth hormone and testosterone, and that involves proper sleep, high intensity training, and good quality protein intake. So sleep, high intensity training, and good quality protein intake are what you need to be doing here. And when we say high intensity training, it needs to be relatively short so we can decrease some of this cortisol effect. So the female fat loss formula is really made up of this piece: control insulin, control cortisol, balance and detox estrogen, and balance that estrogen progesterone ratio, and then really work to raise human growth hormone and testosterone as you go along. So hopefully that is helpful for you. This is one of the key things that it can really distinguish you as a trainer, getting a handle on this and being able to adjust this and deal with people. I can tell you that this piece here, getting rid of the carbs, getting rid of the dairy, getting rid of the fruit, and then adding on to that, these can really turn the things that you're doing into a highly effective fat loss strategy for women. So I hope you enjoyed this month's ME Trainer Academy, and we'll see you next month.